We're going to talk about a subject tonight that that I guess I must deal with at least twice a week with all of the airplanes that I deal with, and that is the issue of an engine making metal and how to deal with it. One of the worst things that happens to aircraft owners, particularly during annual inspections, is the mechanic calls them up and says, "I just found a bunch of metal in your engine." And so we're going to talk about that subject tonight. And we're basically going to talk about three things. First of all, how do we look for metal? And that's actually a little bit more interesting than it sounds, because there's quite a bit more to it than just cutting open the oil filter, and I'll explain that to you. The next thing is, if we find some metal, how can we tell where it's coming from? And the last question is, if we find some metal, how much is too much? That, you know, at what point is it not safe to fly? At what point do we start pulling pieces off the engine? At what point do we start pulling the engine out of the airplane and sending it off to an engine shop? How do we make those decisions? And so those are basically the things we're going to be talking about tonight. And as I usually do in these webinars, I'd like to just start it off with a little war story to illustrate one of the issues of how we look for metal in an engine. And this war story concerned a fire-breathing airplane. It was a V-tail Bonanza that was converted with an STC conversion that basically put a 350 horsepower Lycoming turbocharged TIO 540 J2BD 350 horsepower fire-breathing engine sandwich in this Bonanza. And since the Bonanza was designed for a 285 horsepower engine, you can imagine how it performs with 350 horsepower. Pretty much will hover. At any rate, the owner of this airplane, the airplane was based near Memphis, Tennessee, and the owner of the airplane had a cylinder with low compression, and between he and his mechanic, they decided that that the cylinder was going to need to be replaced, and so they pulled off the cylinder and discovered something surprising. When they pulled the cylinder off, they discovered that the piston, actually the bottom of the piston, had a big gouge in it. That doesn't look good. Well, they pulled the piston off and started looking around and discovered that a lot of stuff in the engine had big gouges in it. And so they decided that that this engine was going to have to come apart. And when they took it apart, they discovered a fairly large quantity of what I guess I would have to call shrapnel floating around in the engine. And it was steel, and it was in copious quantities, as you can see. And it had been flying around inside this engine for God knows how long. Nobody really knows how long. Banging up everything that it contacted. Staring at this shrapnel, most of it was of indeterminate shape, but a few things were not beat up so bad that they weren't recognizable. And in particular, that little goodie that the yellow arrow is pointing to turned out to be a roll pin, something that looks like that. And in this Lycoming engine, there are 6 of these roll pins that serve as oil squirts to squirt oil onto the bottom of the pistons. They go into a hole into an oil galley, and they serve as nozzles, essentially, to squirt oil onto the bottom of the piston. Well, apparently, when this engine was overhauled, somebody did something wrong, and these roll pins were not properly secured, and they came loose, and they just started flying around inside the engine. And they're made of hardened steel, and so when they contacted aluminum things like pistons and the inside of the crankcase, they made something of a mess. Well, of course, the question is, how come none of this had ever been discovered in all of the oil changes and all of the filter cutting and stuff that had been done since that engine was overhauled. Um, the fact that this shrapnel was flying around inside the engine went undetected for a long period of time. And the reason it went undetected, and the reason I'm telling you this story, is because the stuff was too big. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If we take a guided tour of how the oil passes through an engine, it's sort of a simplified schematic diagram just to illustrate. The oil starts out in the oil pan, frequently called the oil sump. In some engines, it's a tank. In most modern horizontally opposed engines, it's an oil pan that bolts to the bottom of the engine, as it was in the case of this Lycoming TIO 540. So there's oil in the oil sump, and it gets sucked into the engine through a pickup tube that has a fairly coarse suction screen at the end of it. So the oil flows through the suction screen into the oil pump. The purpose of the suction screen is to prevent big nasty pieces of metal with serial numbers on it from getting into the oil pump and destroying the oil pump, because obviously we don't want, even if the engine is starting to come apart, we don't want the oil pump to fail. And the oil pump consists of a couple of hardened steel gears rotating inside an aluminum housing, which is fairly soft. So if any chunks of steel ever got into the oil pump, they would score the oil pump housing and render the oil pump either partially or totally incapable of making oil pressure. We don't want that to happen. So there's this relatively coarse suction screen that over the end of the pickup tube that prevents anything larger than, say, a 32nd of an inch in diameter from going into the oil pump. Anything smaller than that will go through the suction screen, go through the oil pump. The oil pump has a pressure relief valve on it, which regulates your oil pressure. And in most engines, the pressure relief valve either has an adjustment screw on it or has a provision for adding or subtracting shims in order to obtain the desired oil pressure out of the oil pump. But it's the oil regulator, oil pressure regulator. And then when the oil comes out of the oil pump, it goes through the oil filter. And after it goes through the oil filter, it enters the oil galleries in the engine and starts lubricating all the things that it's supposed to lubricate. Pressure lubricates bearings and hydraulic lifters, and it splash lubricates pistons and cylinders and camshafts and stuff like that. But at any rate, that's the path that the oil takes, and then after it's finished doing its lubricating job, it falls back into the sump, and it starts the thing all over again. I've simplified this a little. I didn't put the oil cooler in and so on, but that's the basic path that oil takes through the engine. So the point being is that the suction screen at the end of the pickup tube catches the big stuff larger than, say, a 32nd of an inch in diameter to protect the pump. The oil filter catches the small stuff, anything down to about 20 microns or so in diameter. And the very, very small stuff, the little tiny stuff that will pass through the filter and circulate harmlessly through the engine. So when you want to think about metal in an engine, you really need to divide it into three categories: big stuff, small stuff, and tiny stuff. Now, the oil filter is where we see the small stuff. And to inspect the oil filter, we use an oil can cutter. This happens to be the kind I use. It comes from Sacramento Sky Ranch, but there are lots of different cutters. And they have a hardened steel wheel, and they cut the can open. And then after you cut the can open, you cut the filter element off the spool, and In any case, so we cut the media off the spool and spread it out and inspect it carefully. And in this case, you can see that this filter media has some flecks of metal in it in the various pleats. So of course the question is that enough to worry about? And we'll get to that in a moment. But to begin with, just let's make it clear that big stuff that's say a 32nd of an inch or larger, 30 thousandths or so, never gets to the oil filter because because the suction screen prevents it from getting there. Stuff smaller than that will get to the oil filter, but really tiny stuff that's smaller than about 20 microns or a thousandth of an inch passes right through the filter. And even if it got caught by the filter, you couldn't see it. It wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. But the filter gets the stuff in between, say, a 32nd of an inch and 20 microns should get caught in the filter. So the oil filter will catch lots of small stuff like this. This is about a quarter of a teaspoon of metal from a disintegrating camshaft stuck to the end of a mechanic's magnet. But that's little bitty stuff that would be caught in the filter. And if you see that much metal in your filter, you would rise off the ground quite a bit, and then realize that your cam was toast. But if you're not going to find stuff like this. Let us call it shrapnel, in the oil filter because it's too big to get there. It won't get through the suction screen. So we have to look for it elsewhere. Now, Lycoming engines are very nicely designed in this respect because the suction screen on a Lycoming engine is designed to be easily removable and inspectable. And Lycoming says that every time you do an oil change, you not only are supposed to cut open the oil filter to see the small stuff, but you're supposed to remove the suction screen and see if there's any big stuff. A lot of mechanics skip that step, and as you can imagine, that's not a good thing, because the metal that is the most important to know about, which is big stuff, you won't ever see in the oil filter. So it's really important to inspect the suction screen. And on all Lycomings that I know of, the suction screen is inspectable. It's just a 7/8 inch hex that you unsafety wire and remove, and you pull the thing out, you can inspect it. Pretty nice deal. Unfortunately, Continental engines are not designed quite as cleverly in this respect. And the suction screen on a Continental engine is not inspectable without actually dropping the oil pan, which is something you normally couldn't do with the engine in the airplane. And even if you could, it would be a tremendous amount of work because it's held on by a gazillion bolts. So in Continental engines, we can't inspect the suction screen. And so if we want to find out about big stuff, we have to do something a little messy. We have to drain the oil through some kind of a filter. In this case, it's cheesecloth. It can also be some fairly fine window screening. But the only way you'll know about big stuff in a Continental engine is to drain the oil through some sort of a filter that will catch any big stuff that comes out with the oil. Because the suction screen on a Continental engine is not something that can be either removed easily or looked at easily, unfortunately. So with Continentals, we need to strain the oil. With Lycomings, we can pull the suction screen and look at it, but you have to do it. A lot of mechanics skip that step, and most mechanics don't strain the oil on Continental engines. In this particular case, with this Mackin converted Bonanza, the owner was having his maintenance done at a Bonanza specialty shop. And of course, 99.44% of all Bonanzas are powered by Continental engines, because that's what Beach put in them. And so these mechanics were Continental guys, and they didn't even know that Lycomings had a removable suction screen. So they were not looking at the suction screen. And so for a long, long time, all this shrapnel was floating around in this engine doing all sorts of damage. And it wasn't until a cylinder got pulled that this problem was fortuitously noticed. So at any rate, to big stuff, we inspect the suction screen, or we inspect the drained oil by straining it, depending on what kind of engine you've got. Small stuff, we cut open and inspect the oil filter media. And tiny stuff, which goes right through the filter, the only way we find out about that is to send an oil filter out to the lab for spectrographic analysis. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Okay, we find some metal. How do we figure out where it's coming from? Well, the first thing we usually do is check it with a magnet to find out whether it's ferrous or non-ferrous. By checking it with a magnet and looking at its color, we can usually tell generally what kind of metal it is in the broad sense. We can tell whether it's steel, which will adhere to a magnet, whether it's aluminum, which is silver colored but doesn't adhere to a magnet, or whether it's bronze or some other kind of bushing or bearing material, which is sort of yellowish or copper colored and doesn't adhere to a magnet. So the checking it with a magnet is sort of the first step in trying to identify the metal. The second thing we would do is look at it under magnification to see if it has a recognizable shape. Obviously, that shrapnel had some pieces that had a very recognizable shape, and they were immediately recognizable as the roll pins used as oil squirts. We can usually recognize metal that's coming from a disintegrating cam or lifter, for example, by its shape. Not too long ago, we had some semicircular pieces of metal that we found in drained oil in a Continental engine, and we were able to identify by the shape and the fact that although it was bronze in color, it also stuck to a magnet, that this was a disintegrating piston pin bushing. So we can often tell just by looking at it carefully and checking it with a magnet where it's coming from. But we can't always. So if it's not obvious where the metal's coming from after checking it with a magnet and looking at it carefully under a magnifying glass, then we will send it out to a lab for scanning electron microscope analysis. Now that sounds very scary. It really isn't. It's very routine. It costs about $100. We don't do it like at every oil change. We only do it when there's enough metal to concern us. But it sure is spending $100 for an SEM report sure beats doing exploratory surgery on an engine and starting to pull things apart. So we use this tool a lot. Again, most mechanics are not even aware that scanning electron microscope analysis is available. But anytime we see enough metal to be concerned about, and we want to find out where it's coming from without exploratory surgery, the first step is to send it out to a lab and have them analyze it. The report will come back. It will say what the size, shape, and quantity of the metal was, and it will typically tell you the exact alloy of the metal. And from that information, it's usually pretty easy to figure out where the metal is coming from. Laboratory recommendations. There are a lot of oil analysis labs. We like Blackstone Laboratories in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the best. That's what we use for all of our oil analysis. For oil filter scanning electron microscope analysis, we send that work to an outfit called Aviation Laboratories in Kenner, Louisiana. The URLs are up there. Aviation Laboratories also does oil analysis, but we like Blackstone better. Their reports are more comprehensive and so on. I'll show you an example of one in a moment or two. In fact, right now. This is a Blackstone report we just got back, I think, the day before yesterday or something. Very, very current. On an airplane that we're managing. It's a Cirrus SR-22, and it was not a good report. If we take a closer look, we'll see that that the commentary talks about very high wear metals and very high silicon and a bunch of other stuff. And if we take a drill down a little bit further, you'll see that almost every wear metal is way above what it should be. Aluminum should typically be less than 10 parts per million for this engine. It's 24 parts per million. Iron is very high. Normally the iron should be 30 or 40. It's 4 times that high. Copper is high. Nickel is at alert levels, and silicon is extremely high. Silicon would normally be 5, 6, 7 parts per million, and it's about 7 times higher than it should be. So you look at this, and how do you figure out what's going on? Well, we know where various kinds of metals come from. Aluminum typically comes from the piston. Chromium typically comes from rings and valve stems. Iron is a major wear metal, and it's primarily that comes from the cylinder wear on the cylinder barrel. Copper typically comes from bronze components, bearings and bushings and stuff like that. Nickel, unless there are nickel-plated cylinders on the engine, which this engine doesn't have, the only place nickel would come from is exhaust valve guides, which are made out of a very high nickel alloy. So from these numbers, we can tell quite a bit. But in this case, the diagnosis is extremely simple because silicon is through the roof. Silicon means dirt is getting into the engine. And if dirt is getting into the engine, dirt mixed with oil makes a very effective grinding compound, and that alone would be responsible for all the other wear metals being high. So the focus here is to get the dirt out of the engine. So how does the dirt get in the engine? Well, the engine has a bracket air filter, which is one of those black foam air filters. And on the Cirrus, that air filter has the tendency to develop splits. So we will inspect the air filter to make sure that the air filter is okay. The second way that dirt gets into these engines is through an alternate air door or carburetor heat door that is not sealing closed properly. In this case, it's an alternate air door. So that has to be checked. And the third way in the Cirrus in particular is that a bunch of the induction ducts are made of plastic instead of metal, and they have a tendency to chafe through and develop holes in them. So we would need to inspect the induction plumbing, particularly the plastic induction plumbing, and see if there are any holes in it. But the dirt is getting in almost certainly one of those 3 ways. It probably won't take more than 20 minutes to inspect the engine and figure out how the dirt's getting in. And my guess is that once we stop the dirt getting into the engine, all these other metals are going to start to descend back to normal levels. But we'll find out. So we're going to do that. We're going to put this airplane on a 20-hour oil change interval for a while so that we can get more data and sample things more closely. And hopefully all of this stuff will start descending to normal levels before much damage is done. So that's a good example of how we use oil analysis. Okay, let's go back to the oil filter and talk about oil filter and screen. Talk about visible metal as opposed to invisible microscopic metal, which is what the oil analysis report deals with. And let's talk about the threshold question here of if you find metal in the oil filter or in the screen, how much is too much? Is the airplane grounded? Do you have to split the case? What do you do? Well, it turns out that Continental provides absolutely no guidance on this subject. That's actually a point of irritation to me because the majority of the aircraft that my company manages, probably 85 or 90% of them, are Continental powered. I've talked to the top executives at Continental. I begged and pleaded with them to issue a service bulletin on this, and so far they have refused to do so. So Continental provides no guidance whatsoever. Lycoming, on the other hand, offers some very specific guidance on exactly how much metal is too much. And I'm going to go through that with you. Lycoming offers it in a very peculiar place. It's such a peculiar place that most mechanics have never seen it. It's in something called Lycoming Service Instruction 1492D. It's been revised several times, as you can see. It's on the D th revision, so that's, I guess, the 5th revision. And the title of the service bulletin is a very unlikely title. The title is Piston Pin Plug Wear Inspection. Now, if you were a mechanic and you were trying to figure out how much metal is too much when you find it in a filter, you probably would not think of looking at a Lycoming service instruction entitled Piston Pin Plug Wear Inspection. But in fact, that's where Lycoming hides all this wonderful guidance that they provide. And I'm going to go through it with you. This is the head of the service bulletin. The most recent version of it was issued March 20th of 2009, as you can see, and it has this very unlikely title so that nobody knows about it. But let me go through it with you just and give you the essence of it. I don't expect you to read this, but there's basically 2 important parts of this service bulletin. There's a lot of other stuff in it as well. One is this section, which tells you what kinds of metal you can find in a filter where you're still okay to fly, and it gives you specific guidance as to how to do that. And let me decipher this for you so that you can read it, because I'm sure you can't read the small print on the screen. But basically, what this section of that service instruction says is that if you find 1 to 9 small pieces of metal that are a 1/16 of an inch in diameter or smaller, no big deal. Fly the normal oil change interval and then re-inspect at the next oil change. No problem. If you find 10 to 20 small pieces of metal, a 1/16 of an inch in diameter or smaller, they recommend that you fly for 25 hours and re-inspect. And again, when they say re-inspect, they mean cut open the oil filter and pull the suction screen. If you have 20 to 40 small pieces of metal, a 1/16 of an inch in diameter or smaller, they're a little more worried. So they tell you to fly for 10 hours and then re-inspect. And if you find more than 40 pieces of small pieces of metal, 1/16 of an inch in diameter or smaller, and there's actually a caveat on this you'll see on the next slide, then they're getting real concerned. So they want you to do a ground run for 20 to 30 minutes and then re-inspect, cut open the filter. If the filter is clean after a 20 or 30-minute ground run, they say fly for 1 or 2 hours and re-inspect. And if the filter and screen are still clear, then they say fly for 10 hours and re-inspect. So the more pieces of metal in the filter, the more cautious the guidance. But in none of these cases are they saying it's time to ground the airplane. Then we move on to the next part of the service bulletin, which are the conditions under which it's not okay to fly and under which they want you to ground the engine. And let's go through those. It says if you find any large pieces of metal larger than a 1/16 of an inch in diameter, they do not want you to fly the airplane until you have identified where that metal is coming from. If you have a lot of small pieces of metal that total more than a 1/4 teaspoon of metal, which is a huge amount, that if you remember that picture with the magnetic filing stuck to that mechanics magnet, that was about a 1/4 teaspoon. So that's a lot of metal. But if you have more than a 1/4 teaspoon of small pieces of metal, again, they want you to ground the aircraft and investigate. And if you have more than a 1/2 teaspoon of metal, which is a doubly huge amount of metal, I don't think I've ever seen a 1/2 teaspoon of metal in an engine in the 40 years I've been doing this, then they say they want you to remove the engine and tear it down. At any rate, this is very, very specific guidance, and it always gives the engine the benefit of the doubt unless there's either some big pieces of metal floating around or a very large quantity of small pieces of metal Lycoming says okay to fly the airplane. The more metal you find, the shorter you should fly before rechecking. But that's really excellent guidance, and this is something you want to remember, so that if a mechanic says there's metal in your filter and we got to pull your engine apart, you can whip out this unlikely service bulletin and say, oh no, we don't. Lycoming says we fly it another 25 hours or another 10 hours and reinspect. Now, what about Continentals? Continental, as I said, unfortunately, provides no guidance on how much is too much, despite my pleas to the contrary. So in the absence of any guidance for Continental, my own feeling and what I try to convince mechanics of that are working on the airplanes we manage is that if Continental doesn't provide any guidance and Lycoming provides all this very detailed guidance, let's use the Lycoming guidance. I mean, after all, Continentals and Lycomings are extremely similar. Their design is very similar. Pretty much the only difference is Lycomings have the cam on top and Continentals have the cam on the bottom, and everything else pretty much the same. They use the same metallurgy. You know, they're so similar that the Lycoming guidance is really quite reasonable to use on a Continental, in my opinion. On the other hand, your mechanic may disagree with that. If it's a Lycoming, you've got the authority of the manufacturer with this nice service bulletin. If it's a Continental, it may be an uphill fight to convince him that that guidance is reasonable. But that's what we try to do when we find metal in the filter, because we don't want to be, you know, pulling engines apart or pulling them out of airplanes unnecessarily. And we think the Lycoming guidance is a very, very good guide, a very rational, sane roadmap as to what to do when you find metal in the filter. So Charlie, this one is short. That's pretty much it. Just wanted to point out the upcoming webinars that I'm going to be doing. The next one is going to be an advanced class on leaning. We had a really, really good response to our leaning webinar a couple of months ago, and so this one is going to get into some advanced subjects, red box, red fins, that sort of thing, and then I'm going to try to keep it short so there's lots of time for Q&A, because there's always lots of Q&A when it comes to leaning, and then you can see the rest of the webinar. So we got a lot of interesting maintenance subjects coming up once a month, first Wednesday of every month. And that's it, Charlie. I'm going to leave my email address up so that anybody who has a question that we don't get time for, and we do have quite a bit of time for Q&A tonight, fortunately, or if somebody thinks of something later on, you can always reach me at that email address. So that's it. Let's do the Q&A.
Awesome, Mike. Great topic. Caught me off guard with that. Wow, that's the end of it.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Hey, before we go any further, you're going to be at AirVenture. We know that.
Absolutely.
And you might even talk once or twice.
Yes, I'm actually going to be doing a record number of Forums Plaza talks this year, 12 of them, 2 each day of the show, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, every day of the show on 12 different subjects.
You'll literally be able to get a degree from Mike Bush by the end of the week.
Right, and then they're going to have to haul me away. I don't think I'll be able to fly home.
That's the toughest part about trying to fly yourself out at the end of the week. You're worn out. Hey, can you talk a little bit about when you don't have a filter but you have a screen? What's the difference in approach on this stuff?
Well, the guidance is the same. However, I would very, very strongly recommend that anybody who has an engine that's equipped only with an oil screen and not with a full flow spin-on filter, to retrofit a filter. There are kits available for literally every certificated engine that was equipped with a screen to easily convert it to a filter. Some of the filter adapters are ones that screw right into the engine where the screen is. Some of them provide remote mounting of the filter on the firewall, which sometimes is a little more convenient and a little less messy when you're changing the filter. But by going to a full flow filter instead of a screen, you immediately double your oil change interval, because the recommended oil change interval, the maximum oil change interval for engines with a screen is 25 hours, and with a full flow filter it's 50 hours. So you immediately double your oil change interval, so the cost of retrofitting the filter pays for itself very, very quickly. But even more important than that, the filter, A, does a much better job of protecting the engine, and B, makes it much, much easier to inspect for metal. And if metal is found, to take the media and, like I said, send it off to a lab where they can put it under a microscope. So basically the answer to your question is, if you don't have a spin-on oil filter, my recommendation is to retrofit one. It'll cost you $400 or $500 perhaps to do that, but it will pay for itself very quickly in reduced oil changes, and it will give you a much better way of monitoring the engine for metal. So that would be my recommendation, Charlie.
Okay. Jim has a permanent type ADC filter. How is it checked for metal?
I'm not sure. At one time I was familiar with the ADC filter. It's literally been years since I looked at that. My recommendation in general is against using those permanent filters. There have been a number of studies, including one that the Aviation Consumer did a while ago, that show that the standard paper filters from Champion or Tempest do a significantly better job of filtering and catch significantly smaller particle sizes than the permanent metal filters like the ADC, and I think there are a couple of others like that. But I've actually never done an inspection on one of those filters, so I can't really answer from any first-hand knowledge of exactly what the procedure is.
Okay. What causes high phosphorus?
High phosphorus?
Well, it's PHOS. I assume that meant
yeah.
phosphorus.
Well, okay. Well, if it's high phosphorus, what causes high phosphorus is that you're using an oil with an anti-scuff additive. For example, if you change from Aeroshell W100 to Aeroshell W100 Plus, you'll notice that your phosphorus goes through the roof, because W100 Plus has an anti-scuff additive in it called tricresyl phosphate, or actually triphenyl phosphate, TPP. It's butylated triphenyl phosphate, let's be precise, which is a phosphate and is very high in phosphorus. Generally, the phosphorus reading in an oil analysis tells us that the engine is being serviced with one of the oils that has an anti-scuff additive in it, Aeroshell W100 Plus, Aeroshell 15W50, Exxon Elite, or an aftermarket additive like CamGuard, which is high in phosphorus and also high in calcium. So we can always tell when somebody's using CamGuard, because none of the other oil or oil additive packages has calcium in it. But that's what phosphorus is. It's not something the engine generates. It's part of the oil that you put in.
All right, great segue. James would like to know your thoughts on the use of CamGuard.
I love CamGuard. I use it in my airplane. I have for the last 4 years. We recommend it to all of our managed maintenance clients. We have seen dramatic reductions in iron and small reductions in other wear metal. The CamGuard is a combination of an anti-scuff additive and the most effective anti-corrosion additive that we have found so far. So it is particularly valuable for aircraft that fly irregularly, which is true of most owner-flown airplanes, and live in an area of high corrosion risk, such as South Florida, the Gulf, either along either coast, up close to the Great Lakes, any place where there is significant corrosion risk, a cam guard is definitely worth using. It's a little bit on the pricey side. It costs $25 roughly a pint, and you normally put a pint in at each oil change. But what we recommend for most of our managed maintenance clients is either Aeroshell W100 with a pint of cam guard added, or for those people who live in climates where it gets really cold, like Charlie does, Phillips 20W50 with a pint of cam guard added. So, but I'm a big supporter of cam guard. I use it in my own airplane, and I recommend it to my clients.
Well, Mike, that was not why I moved back to Wisconsin.
Okay.
Okay. How accurate are the Blackstone narrative descriptions?
It depends. The Blackstone narrative descriptions can be dead nuts accurate or can be way off, and it really depends on how much contextual information Blackstone, and in particular Riaan Stark, who's the guy that writes all of those narratives, has about your airplane and engine. If they've been analyzing the engine for a decent period of time, and if when you send in the sample you fill out all the information on their information form about whether the aircraft's been idle, what kind of cylinders it has, does it have nitrided steel cylinders, or does it have ECI tight nickel cylinders and stuff? If they know all that stuff, then their narrative is pretty good. But a lot of the time, the samples get sent in not by the owner, but by some mechanic at a shop who really doesn't have a clue. A lot of the information doesn't get filled out. Sometimes they don't even know how much time is on the oil sample. They frequently aren't told what kind of cylinders the thing has. And when they don't have much information, it's hard for them to make an accurate assessment. So for our managed maintenance airplanes, every time a Blackstone report comes back, we study the report, we study the narrative. Sometimes we say, Blackstone's narrative is spot on, and sometimes we say, well, I have to disagree with Riaan in this case because what he didn't know was that your airplane has ECI cylinders, and that's why the nickel is high, not because the exhaust valve guides are wearing, that sort of thing. Because we typically have a lot of context, much more than Blackstone could possibly have, about the airplanes. So it's really one of these garbage in, garbage out situations. The more Blackstone is told about the airplane, how it's used, how the engine's configured, the more accurate their narratives tend to be.
Okay, Jeff reports, great info, Mike. Any special treatment or inspection for aerobatic engines, especially ones with inverted oil systems?
That one is totally above my pay grade. Sorry.
Okay.
We do not manage any aerobatic airplanes to my. Well,
so
I take that back.
Are you saying you would turn the work down?
No, I'm not saying that. Actually, I think we probably do manage some airplanes capable or the permissible of aerobatics, but I don't think we maintain any with inverted oil systems, like serious, like Pitz's or something like that. We're not managing any of those right now.
Okay.
No, I wouldn't turn it down. I wouldn't turn it down. It's just, it's important for a person to know his limits and to know what he doesn't know, and I don't know the answer to that.
All right. Tom was requesting if you could bring up the addresses for Blackstone labs that you had up earlier.
I probably can.
Okay.
Talk amongst yourselves for a moment, please.
Yeah. And then
there it is.
James would like to know, is it reasonable to expect more metal in the first oil change on a new or newly overhauled engine?
Oh, of course. Absolutely. Normally the metal will be very high with the break-in oil, and will be slightly high the next oil change after the break-in oil. Another thing that's important to know or to understand about oil analysis is that when you drain the oil for an oil change, you never drain it all. There's always oil trapped. For example, if there's a controllable pitch propeller, the oil that's trapped in the hub doesn't get drained. There'll be some oil in the prop governor that doesn't get drained. There'll be some oil in the oil cooler that doesn't get drained. So there's always a little bit of carryover from the previous oil change interval to the next oil report. And that's particularly noticeable with something like if you say do a top overhaul on an engine, and you're going to expect a lot of metal in the break-in oil, but there'll be some metal in the next oil change just because you didn't get all the break-in oil drained out. It's just impossible to get it all drained. So there's always a little bit of carryover.
Okay, now that we've brought this slide up, several people are reminding you that you were going to compare and contrast Blackstone versus AvLab reports.
I was?
Apparently.
Well, I don't happen to. If you're talking about oil reports, I don't happen to have the Aviation Laboratory report.
Well, maybe it was oil analysis companies. I know you like Blackstone the best.
Well, Blackstone provides the most comprehensive information. If you compare a Blackstone report with any other lab, there's just more information on the Blackstone report than anybody else. Aviation Laboratories would probably be my number 2 choice, and as I said, we use them for all of our filter analysis. They're okay for oil analysis as well. It's just that we think the Blackstone reports are more comprehensive. Both companies use good, up-to-date, accurate equipment and so on. There are some other oil labs that I will not name that I sort of actively recommend people not using, but both of these labs do a good job on oil analysis. We just prefer Blackstone because their reports are a little bit more comprehensive. Blackstone does not do filter analysis; they only do oil analysis. So we send our filters to AvLab and we send our oil samples to Blackstone.
Okay, several questions about.
Shall I go back to the other slide with my email address, or shall I leave this one up?
Sure, you can go ahead. Don't run through them too fast because it'll sometimes slow things down on the. I've had that happen on a different webinar. But a couple of questions here about Marvel Mystery Oil.
Okay.
If you want to touch that one.
Just
remember, we do have amateur builders in the audience that can do that.
Oh yeah, no, anybody can do that. Here we go. Let me just do this. There we go. Go directly to the slide and not pass go. Marvel Mystery Oil. First of all, Marvel Mystery Oil is no longer a mystery. The stuff was invented in the 20s, and like Coca-Cola, they kept the formula secret until the EPA demanded that they had to issue a material safety data sheet, an MSDS sheet, which essentially every chemical now has to publish. If you look at the MSDS for Marvel Mystery Oil, you will discover it has some fascinating ingredients. It has pig fat. It has red food coloring. It has perfume. It has some really interesting stuff in it. Basically, though, Marvel Mystery Oil is a solvent. It has some history of effectiveness in freeing up stuck hydraulic lifters, and so if I hear some lifter clatter on an engine, I have been known to look both ways just to make sure there weren't any friendlies around, and then accidentally pour a little Marvel Mystery Oil into the oil sump. I do not use it or recommend it as something to be used as a normal prophylactic thing on a regular basis. I would only use it if there's a specific problem that needs to be resolved, like a clattering lifter. I also would strongly recommend not using it as a fuel additive. If you're going to use it as an oil additive. Do not use it as a fuel additive. But basically, it's a solvent, and it can help unstick stuck things. There is one school of thought that if a cylinder is blowing a lot of oil because of a stuck oil control ring, you take out the top spark plug, fill the cylinder up with marble mystery oil, let it soak in overnight, and then force it into the crankcase by turning the prop and drain the oil and service the sump with fresh oil. I have other techniques that I use for freeing up stuck rings that don't involve marble mystery oil, but that's one possible use of it. But basically, if you're going to use it to free up something that's stuck. Don't use it as just a normal thing that you do at every oil change. It's not approved by anybody, but it doesn't really need to be. And so far as I know, nobody has ever been busted for using MMO in a certified aircraft engine.
Your mileage may vary.
That's right.
Okay.
But I will add that the last time I used it, I believe the statute of limitations has now run. So
okay. Several people would like your thoughts on AvBlend.
AvBlend, interesting stuff. When AvBlend, first of all, AvBlend is again something that's ancient. It is a repackaged automobile additive that was called Lenkite, Lenkite, and they decided that they could jack up the price and sell it to aircraft owners under the name AvBlend. When AvBlend first came out and was touting that it was the best thing since sliced bread, we ran some tests on some twin-engine airplanes where we treated one engine and didn't treat the other. And we put those twins on an oil analysis program, and we could not tell the difference. We could not tell which engine was treated. My conclusion from those tests was that AvBlend has no demonstrable benefit. On the other hand, it does no harm. There are some additives, like the ones that have Teflon in them, or PTFE, that can do harm and that I would actively recommend against using. AvBlend, my posture is neutral. As far as I can see, it doesn't do any good. But if it makes you sleep better at night, I would not discourage you from using it, because as far as I can tell, it does no harm either.
Okay, Alvin would like to know, when would you start getting oil analyzed on a new or rebuilt engine?
Probably with the second oil change. I probably wouldn't bother to send the break-in oil to the lab. In fact, I normally get rid of break-in oil in about 10 hours, although most of the manufacturers recommend 25. But I would start the oil analysis immediately with the first oil that's the normal operating oil, as opposed to the break-in oil. And I would continue it at every oil change. One of the things that's really important is to understand that oil analysis is a trend monitoring technique. You don't learn a whole lot from any one sample. What we're interested in doing is establishing a baseline signature for an engine, and then looking for departures from that signature. So we have oil samples sent in at every oil change on all of the airplanes that we manage. Some owners only take an oil sample once a year. We don't think that's enough. Some owners don't take oil samples until they think something's wrong. That's a really bad idea, because you just don't have any history to go on. But you know, oil analysis is $30 or something like that, maybe 40 tops, and it's a trivial part of the cost of an oil change. and so we recommend doing it at every oil change.
Okay. Ray would like to know, how critical is the calendar time limit on oil changes? Recommendation seems to be every 50 hours or 4 months, whichever comes first. And then I guess I would ask, what about if you're in a colder climate versus someplace like where you live?
Well, we recommend 50 hours or 4 months, with whichever comes first. You know, unless there's some reason to do it more often. There are a number of reasons you might want to do it more often than that. Not having a spin-on filter, of course, is one. Operating in a dirty or dusty environment, if you're operating off you know, dirt strips or grass strips or whatever, is another reason. Or if the oil analysis looks bad, you know, like the one we looked at, we're going to put that airplane temporarily on a 20-hour oil change interval, and then only when things normalize will we go back to the normal interval. I believe in the 4-month calendar limit. I do that on my own airplane. There are I tend to fly pretty seasonally. I fly a tremendous amount during the summer, like this month-and-a-half trip where I'm basically be living out of the airplane for 45 or 50 days. During the winter, I fly a lot less. So, you know, during the summer, I usually run into the 50 hours first. During the winter, I usually run into the 4 months first. You know, I would feel less strongly about it if the airplane was in an area of low corrosion risk. If it was, you know, based in Denver or Tucson or something like that, I'd feel more strongly about it. If it's an area of high corrosion risk, like Florida, I am 8 miles from the Pacific Ocean, where my airplane's based, and so I consider that I am in an area of moderately high corrosion risk. The airplane is hangared, which helps a little bit, but we recommend the 50 hours or 4 months, whichever comes first, to our clients. That's what I do on my own airplane as well.
Okay, and Mike has 2.5 hours on ground, is giving gray oil with no small particles. Is this normal for a new overhaul with crank, cam, tappets, etc. replaced? No large metal particles yet. Have filter installed.
I'm not sure what the question is. The oil has turned gray after a couple of hours.
Yeah,
on a newly overhauled engine.
Yep.
Well, you know, on a newly overhauled engine, a lot of stuff happens in the first hour, so I don't think I would get particularly excited about it in that case. Again, my recommendation, which is a little different than the manufacturer's, is to get rid of the break-in oil after about 10 hours, and then by then the break-in should be 99% complete. In fact, it's really should be 99% complete after the first hour or two, and if you're doing it right and running it hard. And you know, if the oil starts turning dark quickly after the first oil change, then I would be more concerned. But you know, a lot of metal gets generated during that first hour after an overhaul, as all of the sharp peaks of the hone pattern in all the cylinders get rounded off, which is really what the break-in is all about. So I don't think I'd be particularly concerned.
Okay, and Jack would like to know, should an engine be ran weekly even though it is not flown?
Well, that's a tough question. The problem with not running the engine weekly is that the protective oil film breaks down, and eventually expensive ferrous components like cylinder barrels and cam lobes and stuff may start to corrode because they've lost their protective oil film. The other side of the coin, though, is that when you run the engine on the ground, when you run the engine anytime really, it generates a lot of water. The water is one of the largest byproducts of combustion of air and avgas. And when you're flying the airplane and the oil is up to full operating temperature, which should normally be 180, 190, 200 degrees on the gauge, the moisture that the engine is generating is vapor, and it gets sent out the breather. When you run the engine on the ground, where you almost never have things up to full operating temperature, the water tends to stay in the engine, and so if you keep doing ground runs and not fly, that water will just keep building up a little bit more and a little bit more each time you run the engine, and it never gets a chance to get purged. So that's really the problem. It is definitely better to fly the airplane, take it around the patch a couple times. If for some reason you have to run it on the ground and you can't fly because the weather's terrible or something, then try to make sure that you run it long enough so that the oil gets as close to full operating temperature as possible, and run it that way for a while in order to be able to purge moisture out of the engine. You've got to get the oil hot enough to vaporize the moisture. The oil temperature probe that drives your gauge is at the coldest part of the oil cycle, typically right after the oil cooler. So if it shows, and it rises about 40 degrees at its hottest point. So if you've got 180 on the gauge, then the oil at its hottest point will get up to 220, which is above the boiling point of water. The other problem with running it on the ground is that the boiling point of water is a lot higher on the ground than it is up at altitude. And again, when you fly the airplane up at 5,000 feet, it's a whole lot easier for it to get rid of the water because the boiling point of water is a whole lot lower up at 5,000 feet than it is at sea level. But if you have to run it on the ground, just make sure that you get the oil up to full operating temperature as close as possible, and run it for a while with it at that temperature before you shut down in order to purge the moisture.
Okay, William would like to know, is there anything that you would learn from using a bore scope that you wouldn't get from an oil analysis?
Oh, absolutely. There's no comparison whatsoever. Borescopy is, and that's a subject for, actually we covered a lot of the borescopy stuff in my cylinder webinar, which is the video of it is on the EAA site. But what you find out from a borescope inspection, what you find out from oil analysis is just completely, totally different. I mean, for example, on one hand, that engine that we just looked at that was getting dirt into it and had all these high wear metals, you would never be able to know that from a borescope. You'd know that from oil analysis. On the other hand, if an exhaust valve was burning, you would instantly know it from a borescope, and you'd never know it from oil analysis. So there's almost no intersection at all between what the oil analysis tells you and what the borescope tells you. I'm sort of kind of amazed at the question, because there's very, very little overlap between the two, and both of them are super important. We borescope every cylinder of every aircraft that we manage at every annual inspection, and anytime there's any reason to suspect a problem, anytime we see some funny wiggles in the engine monitor data, the very first thing we do is pull a top spark plug and stick a borescope and take a look. And there's a lot of good information on borescopy and what we're looking for and stuff in the cylinder webinar that's up on the EAA site.
Okay, Edward would like to know how you feel about continuous use of crankcase heaters.
Interesting question. There was a very, very excellent study done by Tanis on this subject. And the results of Tanis's study has been absolutely borne out in my experience. And basically what Tanis determined, and what I have seen on any number of occasions, is that if you run a preheater continuously, it will cause accelerated corrosion on some component of the engine. It depends on what the engine is, but for example, on big bore Continental engines, what it will do is rust out the starter adapter. Starter adapter is about a $3,000 part and takes 4 hours to replace, so this is not a good thing. Basically, what running the heater does is it vaporizes the moisture that's in the oil. And as we said, anytime you run the engine, you put a bolus of water in the oil. And that water vapor will drift around inside the engine until it finds something cold that the heater is not heating, and it will condense on that cold thing. And in big bore Continentals, the coldest thing in the engine is the starter adapter. And so that's where the lion's share of the condensation occurs. And it will just rust the starter adapter completely to the point of being unusable. And you will wind up not being able to start the engine. So now the one exception to that, and this is again from the Tanis study, is that if you hook the engine up to a source of desiccant dried air. There are a number of units that you can buy. There's a nice one that Tempest makes that Spruce sells, that you hook up to the breather when the airplane is not flying, and it has a little tiny air pump in it, and it pumps air through a desiccant chamber, a chamber of desiccant crystals, to dry the air to essentially zero humidity, and then it blows it into the engine, which forces the moist air out of the engine and keeps a continuous flow of pre-dried air going into the engine. And if you do that, which essentially purges all the moisture, any water vapor that's in the engine, then it's okay to run the heater. If with one of these engine dryers, you can run the heater full time. But if you don't have an engine dryer hooked up, you can't run the heater full time. And I have personally seen a lot of rust damage on airplanes, and I'll see a rusted starter adapter, and I'll say to the owner, do you have an electric heater on it? They say yes. I say, do you run it full time, or you just run it right before you want to fly the airplane cold weather? Oh yeah, I keep it plugged in all the time. Well, that's the reason.
Well, Mike, great webinar. I want to thank you for taking the time tonight to share your knowledge with everybody. We had over 400 people on tonight, so a good turnout.
Oh, terrific.
And any last thoughts on this subject?
No, other than if anybody comes up with a question that either you didn't have time to ask or you didn't think to ask, just make a note of my email address and drop me a note. I'm a very good email guy. I literally live my life on email, it seems, and I'll be happy to respond to you. So thanks everybody for coming, and I look forward to seeing you on July 3rd for our advanced leaning session.